July 2003, Abu Dhabi launches Etihad, backed by one of the wealthiest governments on Earth. And within just 8 months after its launch, the airline had placed the largest aircraft order in aviation history for a startup carrier. But this was just the beginning. Because just 5 years later, Etihad shocked the world when it placed an order for over 200 aircraft, worth almost $43 billion. At the time, it was the single largest aircraft order ever placed by any airline anywhere in the world. At its peak, Etihad was the fastest growing airline on Earth. It operated the most luxurious flying product commercial aviation had ever seen, and it even held equity stakes in carriers across 5 continents. And then, within just a few years of that peak, Etihad would lose billions of dollars.
The losses just keep mounting for Etihad Airways.
Etihad lost billions of dollars.
Lay off nearly a third of its entire workforce.
Etihad has made layoffs across several departments.
And cancel the majority of its aircraft orders just to stay afloat. For an airline with virtually unlimited government backing, this kind of collapse shouldn't have been possible. So, what happened? How did the airline that should have been the next Emirates end up becoming one of aviation's biggest cautionary tale? And why, even after a painful recovery, is the airline once again inching dangerously closer to yet another collapse? But before we understand their collapse, we first need to go back in time to see exactly how it all began. It's the 1970s. At the time, the Middle East had only one big airline connecting the region with the world, Gulf Air, which is today the national carrier of Bahrain. But back then, it wasn't a national airline in the traditional sense. In fact, it was jointly owned by 4 governments: Bahrain, Qatar, Oman, and Abu Dhabi. And for much of the Gulf, it was the only credible gateway to international travel. This was also the period when oil prices had begun to shoot up and billions of dollars started flooding into the region. But rulers in Dubai realized something critical. Relying on a single revenue source wasn't a sustainable long-term strategy. Instead, what the region needed were alternative engines of economic growth, ones that were capable of sustaining prosperity well beyond the era of hydrocarbons. So, in 1985, Emirates launched its operations, with luxury service and operational excellence as its founding principles. But the decision to build an airline specifically wasn't arbitrary. You see, before launching Emirates, Dubai had noticed that Gulf Air had been quietly cutting back its flights to Dubai, making the city dangerously dependent on a regional carrier with little incentive to prioritize it. Dubai's leadership recognized that if the Emirate was to become a global hub, it needed its own flag carrier, one entirely aligned with its own ambitions. By launching its own airline, Dubai secured not only strategic independence, but also gained something far more valuable: an instrument to project its identity to every major city on Earth. Beyond the commercial logic, Emirates also became the primary architect of Dubai's economic growth, the single most powerful engine of its tourism economy, and the most visible signal to the world that this small emirate was building something far larger than oil could ever deliver. The success of Emirates did not go unnoticed. Qatar took careful note, launched its own carrier, and in 2002 became the first Gulf state to formally withdraw from Gulf Air, redirecting its energy and capital into what would eventually become Qatar Airways. By now, even the Sheikh of Abu Dhabi, Sheikh Khalifa bin Zayed Al Nahyan, had observed the pattern unfold before his eyes and understood the strategic importance of launching their own airline. So, the very next year following Qatar's withdrawal, Abu Dhabi decided to pull out of Gulf Air as well and form its own airline, Etihad Airways. What followed was unlike anything the aviation industry had previously seen from a brand new carrier. Usually, launching and certifying a commercial airline is ordinarily a slow, methodical process. Regulatory approvals, fleet agreements, route licensing, pilot training, the process is long and demanding. But money was simply not a constraint for young Etihad. As a result, within the same year it was founded, in November 2003, the airline launched its first commercial route between Abu Dhabi and Beirut. And then, just 8 months after that first flight, Etihad announced something that stopped the entire aviation industry in its tracks. The airline placed an order for 24 Airbus wide-body aircraft, including the A330, A340, and the massive A380, with a combined value of nearly $7 billion. Etihad's own chairman openly acknowledged the audacity of the move, stating at the signing ceremony that he could not recall a time in aviation history when a startup barely 8 months old had placed orders for 36 wide-body aircraft with a combined value exceeding $7 billion. But the reason for this bold decision, at least in part, was inspired by the runaway success of Emirates. You see, Emirates was turning profits within just a year of its operation, and within 5 years, the airline was carrying close to 2 million passengers annually. Etihad assumed that if it could expand fast enough, it could replicate Emirates' success. What Etihad failed to examine, however, was how Emirates had actually built that foundation. Despite sitting on billions of dollars worth of oil, the Dubai government didn't spend lavishly on new aircraft from day one. Instead, they wet leased aircraft from Pakistan with an investment of $10 million. And only when the airline turned profitable did they invest in new aircraft, making the entire operation self-sustaining from the ground up. But Etihad wasn't interested in a slow build. And what they did next was even more shocking. Just a few years after their $7 billion order, in 2008, they placed yet another massive order. Only this time, it was for over 200 aircraft, many of which were wide bodies, with a combined value of almost $43 billion. At the time, it was the largest order in aviation history. This was meant to set the stage for Etihad's dramatic growth, going from nothing to one of the world's largest airlines, connecting all 6 continents in the span of just a decade. But unfortunately, what they did next would quietly lay the groundwork for a collapse that no one saw coming. You see, by the early 2010s, Etihad had expanded to over 66 destinations worldwide. While that was impressive growth, it still left them well behind Emirates, which was already serving more than 105 cities. But as Etihad tried to expand further, it ran into roadblocks it wasn't even expecting. Several Western nations, pressured by their domestic carriers, launched coordinated campaigns against the rapid growth of Middle Eastern airlines, arguing that state subsidies gave carriers like Etihad an unfair competitive advantage, which violated the foundational principles of open skies agreements. And as if that wasn't already bad enough, there was one more issue which made the situation even worse. At the time, Etihad Airways operated a total fleet of 57 aircraft, out of which 45 were wide bodies. While that configuration suited a hub-and-spoke model connecting major cities, it made it nearly impossible to serve smaller regional airports and achieve the network depth a true global carrier requires. So, once again, Etihad made an unlikely decision. Instead of joining a typical airline alliance like Star Alliance or Oneworld, Etihad's then CEO James Hogan decided that the best strategy would be to invest in struggling airlines, obviously at a lowball valuation, and use its financial muscle to restructure them and build its own de facto alliance. A constellation of codeshare partners bolstering each other's networks, with Etihad at the center. Simply put, Etihad was doing what Star Alliance and One World took decades to build, except it was doing it with a checkbook. So, in 2011, Etihad acquired almost a 30% stake in Air Berlin, which at the time was going through severe financial turmoil due to poor strategic decisions at the corporate level. While Air Berlin was making significant losses in the years prior to the acquisition, 2011 was by far the worst. Yet, Etihad was confident and went ahead with the acquisition anyway. The following year, Etihad continued its acquisition spree, taking stakes in Air Seychelles, Aer Lingus, Virgin Australia, and Air Serbia. These were relatively modest investments in relatively modest carriers, not large enough individually to threaten Etihad's finances. Air Berlin, however, was a different matter. With hundreds of aircraft and a structural inability to turn a consistent profit, it managed only $7 million in profit across the whole of 2012, a figure that should have prompted serious alarm. While Air Berlin quietly hemorrhaged value, a new opportunity emerged in India. To boost its foreign direct investment, the Indian government announced it would permit foreign airlines to acquire up to a 49% stake in domestic carriers. For Etihad, this was an opening too significant to ignore. So, in November 2013, the airline acquired a 24% stake in Jet Airways, India's largest carrier at the time, for $379 million. While this seemed like a smart way to capture the massive and fast-growing Indian aviation market, Jet Airways, like so many of Etihad's other equity partners, was another airline in desperate need of a turnaround. Even though Etihad continued expanding its global network, on the product side, it was still trailing Emirates and Qatar Airways in passenger experience. So, in 2014, they responded with what would become their most celebrated product, the Residence. A 3-room private suite aboard its new Airbus A380s, complete with a double bedroom, a private lounge, and a trained butler. The campaign that followed, called Flying Reimagined, positioned Etihad as the definitive statement in ultra-luxury travel. The Residence was genuinely impressive, and for the first time, it seemed like Etihad was finally heading in the right direction. And then it announced yet another fateful acquisition. This time, a 49% stake in Alitalia, the chronically troubled Italian flag carrier, for $750 million. But anyone familiar with Alitalia's long history of government bailouts, labor conflicts, and structural inefficiency would have viewed this with serious skepticism. Yet, once again, Etihad was confident in its strategy, and looking back, perhaps a little overconfident. And that confidence might have been partly due to what happened that year. Because in 2015, Etihad recorded one of its highest profits ever, $103 million, while flying almost 17.6 million passengers. But what Etihad failed to consider was its other partnership investments, which were all generating losses that it was partly responsible for absorbing. And the gains from its core operation were being progressively offset by the weight of investments that were not recovering on any credible timeline. The curtain finally fell in 2017, when Air Berlin seized all operations, becoming one of the largest airline failures in European history.
Air Berlin's Germany's second largest carrier has filed for insolvency after its main shareholder, Etihad, declared it would not be providing further financial support.
As if that wasn't already bad enough, Alitalia went bankrupt the same year and entered extraordinary administration after its employees rejected a restructuring plan that would have required significant pay concessions. In the span of a single year, 2 of Etihad's most significant equity bets had collapsed completely, and the airline now found itself losing billions of dollars year on year, all while being forced to abandon its global ambitions. The response was painful and unavoidable. Given their dire financial state, Etihad could no longer sustain loss-making routes. In response, they began to scale back and cancel routes one by one. The situation was so bad that they halved their service to the United States in pretty much 1 year, and canceled routes and frequencies to cities where Emirates and Qatar Airways continued to serve profitably, due to their balanced approach to scale and efficiency. And then came the shocker Etihad wasn't prepared for. In 2019, Jet Airways, one of its biggest bets and one that had been draining its cash this whole time, collapsed under the weight of mounting debt after failing to secure emergency funding from its lenders.
Jet Airways has shut down all operations after the airline's request for an emergency fund was rejected.
At this point, the financial losses were no longer manageable through cost-cutting alone. Rather, Etihad needed something radical. Following this development, the company announced a major restructure, which would focus on profitability over growth. Their CEO, James Hogan, was forced to step down and was replaced by Tony Douglas, a British executive hired to clean up the mess left by the Equity Alliance fallout. Moreover, Etihad officially abandoned any plans of competing with Emirates or Qatar as a super connector. Instead, it would focus only on routes with enough demand for travel to and from its hub rather than chasing the breadth of a wider network. But more importantly, Etihad canceled almost all of its unfilled orders for new widebodies and retired its entire fleet of A330s, which had previously been the backbone of the airline. But when the pandemic hit global aviation hard, Etihad's problems went from bad to worse. Etihad laid off almost 7,000 employees, representing almost 30% of the group's total workforce, just to stay afloat. The airline that once planned to take on global aviation head-on and serve all 6 continents with its sheer financial backing was now forced to retreat. But when Antonio Neves took over as the new CEO in 2022, Etihad undertook a serious and disciplined restructuring of its operations. The airline streamlined its network, tightened its cost structure, and refocused on sustainable growth rather than scale for its own sake. He also brought the A380 back into service to meet recovering demand. In fact, last year, Etihad reported its strongest financial performance on record, posting a profit of $698 million. For an airline that had been losing billions annually just a few years earlier, it was a meaningful recovery. But just as Etihad appeared to have emerged from its decade of self-inflicted wounds, a new threat arrived, and this one had nothing to do with Etihad's decisions. You see, when the United States announced escalating military tensions with Iran earlier this year, Middle Eastern carriers, including Etihad, had no choice but to severely limit their operations across affected airspace corridors. Carriers that had built their entire business model on banked connections at mega hubs, moving the world through Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and Doha, suddenly found themselves bleeding over $200 million per day in lost revenue, with costs now having exceeded tens of billions. With the image of safety now gone, the future of Etihad, on which Abu Dhabi's tourism heavily depends, hangs in the balance. So, what do you guys think? Will Etihad be able to bounce back to pre-war levels? And even if it does, will it ever be able to take on Emirates and Qatar? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe to the video.